What if I told you that the person responsible for one of Wisconsin's most haunting unsolved murders lived just a few doors down from the crime scene for over 2 decades? What if the killer walked the same streets, shopped at the same stores, and smiled politely at the very investigators searching for them? In the summer of 2001, a brutal homicide in a quiet Milwaukee neighborhood shattered a community and left a family desperate for answers. For 23 years, this cold case gathered dust while the person responsible lived an ordinary life, their secret buried deep. But in 2024, a breakthrough in forensic genealogy would change everything, leading to an arrest that shocked the entire community and proved that some cold cases are never truly cold. This is the story of Michael Shaw, a beloved neighbor whose murder remained unsolved for over 2 decades, and the stunning revelation that his killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. Let me introduce you to Michael Shaw. In the summer of 2001, Michael was 38 years old and living the kind of life that most people dream about. He owned Shaw's Hardware on North Avenue in Milwaukee, a family business that his father had started back in 1967. The store wasn't just a place to buy nails and paint. It was a community hub where neighbors gathered to swap stories, get advice on home repairs, and catch up on local news. Michael knew every customer by name, remembered their kids' birthdays, and always threw in a few extra screws or a discount for elderly customers on fixed incomes. Those who knew Michael describe him as one of those rare people who genuinely cared about everyone he met. He had an easy smile that reached his eyes, a firm handshake, and the kind of presence that made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. His employees loved working for him because he treated them like family. When one of his workers was going through a difficult divorce, Michael quietly paid for her lawyer fees and never mentioned it again. That was just who he was. Outside of work, Michael was a devoted father to 2 young daughters, Emma and Lily, who were 7 and 9 years old that summer. His wife, Jennifer, had passed away from cancer 3 years earlier, and Michael had become both mother and father to those girls. Every evening after closing the store, he'd rush home to help with homework, make dinner, and tuck them into bed with elaborate bedtime stories that he'd make up on the spot. The girls would giggle as he did different voices for each character, and neighbors could often hear their laughter through the open windows on warm summer nights. Michael was also a volunteer coach for the neighborhood Little League team, the Milwaukee Meteors. He wasn't particularly athletic himself, but he had an incredible gift for making every kid on that team feel like a star. Parents would later recall how he'd stay late after practice to work with the kids who struggled, never showing frustration, always finding something to praise. One father remembered Michael telling his son, who had just struck out for the 3rd time, "You know what I saw? I saw you keep your eye on the ball every single time. That's the hardest part, and you've already got it down. The hitting will come." That's the kind of man Michael Shaw was. On his block of Elm Street, a tree-lined avenue in a working-class neighborhood on Milwaukee's northwest side, Michael was beloved. He mowed lawns for elderly neighbors, organized block parties in the summer, and was always the first person to shovel snow from someone's driveway after a storm. When the Johnsons' house caught fire in 1999, Michael organized a fundraiser that raised over $10,000 to help them rebuild. He was, quite simply, the kind of neighbor everyone wanted, the kind of person who made a community feel like a community. Michael lived in a modest 2-story home that he'd inherited from his grandmother. It was painted a cheerful yellow with white trim, with a small front porch where he liked to sit in the evenings, drinking iced tea and watching the neighborhood kids play. The house was filled with family photos, his daughter's artwork on the refrigerator, and the comfortable clutter of a single dad doing his best to keep everything together. In the backyard, he'd built a treehouse for Emma and Lily, complete with a rope ladder and a wooden sign that read Shaw Sisters' Secret Clubhouse. His daily routine was predictable, comforting in its consistency. Up at 6 in the morning, breakfast with the girls, drop them off at his parents' house by 7:30, open the hardware store by 8. Lunch was usually a sandwich at his desk while doing paperwork. Close the store at 6, pick up the girls, dinner, homework, bedtime stories, and then finally a little time to himself to watch the news or read. Weekends were reserved for the girls, Little League, and community activities. It was a good life, a simple life, a life that Michael had worked hard to build after losing his wife. Everyone who knew Michael Shaw would tell you the same thing. He was one of the good ones. A pillar of his community, a devoted father, a generous friend, a man who made the world a little bit better just by being in it. Which is why what happened on August 15, 2001, was so incomprehensible, so devastating, so utterly senseless. August 15, 2001, dawn bright and hot, the kind of muggy Milwaukee summer morning where the air feels thick even before the sun fully rises. By 8 o'clock, the temperature was already climbing into the 80s, and shopkeepers along North Avenue were opening their doors, cranking up their air conditioning, and preparing for another busy day. But at Shaw's Hardware, something was wrong. Very wrong. Michael's store manager, Patricia Gonzalez, who had worked for him for 12 years, arrived at 7:45 to find the front door locked and the lights off. This had never happened before. Michael was always there early, usually by 7:30 at the latest, getting the register ready and organizing the day's deliveries. Patricia pulled out her keys and let herself in, calling out Michael's name. Silence. The store was exactly as they'd left it the night before. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. But Michael's truck, which he always parked in the small lot behind the building, wasn't there. Patricia felt a knot forming in her stomach. She immediately called Michael's home phone. It rang and rang, going to voicemail. She tried his cell phone. Same thing, straight to voicemail. This wasn't like Michael at all. He was incredibly reliable, almost obsessively so. Even when he was sick, he'd call ahead to let her know he'd be late. For him to simply not show up without a word was unthinkable. By 8:15, when the store should have been open and customers were starting to gather outside, Patricia made the decision to call Michael's parents, Robert and Dorothy Shaw, who lived about 15 minutes away. Dorothy answered on the second ring, and Patricia could immediately hear the confusion in her voice. No, they hadn't heard from Michael that morning. He'd picked up the girls the previous evening around 6:30, right on schedule, and everything had seemed fine. He'd mentioned something about needing to get home to fix a leaky faucet. The girls were supposed to be dropped off at their house that morning by 7:30, but Michael had never arrived. Now Dorothy Shaw's voice took on an edge of panic. Where were her granddaughters? Where was her son? Patricia told Dorothy she was calling the police immediately. At 8:23 a.m., she dialed 911 and reported that her employer and his 2 young daughters were missing, that he had failed to show up for work, and that this was completely out of character. The dispatcher took down the information and said officers would be sent to Michael's residence for a welfare check. 2 patrol officers, Officer Jennifer Martinez and Officer Thomas Kowalski, were dispatched to the Shaw residence on Elm Street. They arrived at 8:47 a.m. The house looked peaceful in the morning sun, the yellow paint cheerful, the porch tidy. Michael's truck was parked in the driveway, which immediately struck the officers as significant. If Michael was missing, why was his vehicle at home? Officer Martinez approached the front door and knocked loudly, identifying herself as police. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time, calling out that they were conducting a welfare check. Still nothing. Officer Kowalski walked around to the side of the house, checking windows, looking for any signs of disturbance. That's when he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The back window, a small one that led into the kitchen, was open about 3 inches. Not much, but enough. In a neighborhood where people were generally careful about home security, it stood out. Officer Kowalski called out to his partner, and they made the decision to enter the residence. Officer Martinez tried the front door. Locked. They moved to the back door. Also locked. But that open window provided legal justification for entry during a welfare check. Officer Kowalski, being the smaller of the two, squeezed through the kitchen window, dropping down onto the linoleum floor with a soft thud. He moved to the back door and unlocked it from the inside, letting Officer Martinez in. They both drew their weapons, moving cautiously through the house, calling out, announcing their presence. The kitchen was neat, dishes washed and drying in the rack. The living room was tidy, toys organized in bins, the television off. They moved down the hallway toward the bedrooms, their footsteps echoing in the silent house. The first bedroom they checked was clearly the daughter's room, decorated with posters of Disney princesses and stuffed animals arranged on twin beds. Empty. The bathroom was next. Also empty. Then they reached the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was partially open. Officer Martinez pushed it wider with her foot, her weapon raised, and that's when she saw him. Michael Shaw was lying on the floor beside his bed, on his back, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling. There was blood, a significant amount of it, soaked into the carpet around his head and upper body. His right arm was extended, as if he'd been reaching for something. His left hand was clenched into a fist. Officer Martinez immediately keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Dispatch, we have a deceased individual at this location. Requesting detectives and medical examiner. This is now a crime scene." But there was another critical question that needed immediate answering. Where were the two little girls? For several terrifying minutes, Officers Martinez and Kowalski searched the rest of the house with renewed urgency, calling out for Emma and Lily Shaw, praying they would find them alive, fearing they might find them dead. They checked every closet, under every bed, in the basement, in the attic access. The girls were not in the house. Officer Martinez made another radio call, this time requesting an immediate Amber Alert and additional units to search the neighborhood. Every second counted. If the children had been taken, if they were in danger, time was the enemy. But then Officer Kowalski, rechecking the daughter's bedroom more carefully, noticed something that provided the first sliver of hope in this nightmare scenario. The girls' beds had been slept in, but several items were missing. Lily's favorite backpack, decorated with butterflies, usually hung on a hook by the door, gone. Emma's stuffed rabbit that she carried everywhere, a worn pink bunny named Fluffy, also gone. And on the small desk in the corner, there was a handwritten note in adult handwriting. The note read, "Girls, I need you to walk to Grandma and Grandpa's house this morning instead of waiting for me to drive you. Take the route we've practiced. Stay together. I love you both so much, Dad." Officer Martinez immediately called the Shaw grandparents. Dorothy Shaw answered, her voice frantic, demanding to know what was happening. Officer Martinez asked a single crucial question. "Mrs. Shaw, are your granddaughters with you right now?" There was a pause and then Dorothy's voice, confused but confirming, "Yes. They showed up about 2 hours ago on foot. They had a note from Michael." "Officer, what is going on? Where is my son?" The girls were safe. Thank God, the girls were safe. But their father was dead, murdered in his own home sometime during the night of August 14th or the early morning hours of August 15th. The medical examiner would later determine that Michael Shaw had been struck multiple times with a blunt object, sustaining fatal head trauma. But before he died, in what must have been excruciating pain, knowing he was gravely injured, Michael Shaw had done something extraordinary. He had written that note to his daughters. He had somehow found the strength to protect them one final time, to get them out of the house, away from danger, away from the horror of discovering their father's body. The investigators would later piece together that Michael had likely regained consciousness briefly after the initial attack, realized he was dying, and used his last moments of clarity to save his children from trauma. He'd placed the note where he knew they'd find it when they woke up, trusting that they'd follow his instructions. It was a father's final act of love, a gesture so profound that even the hardened detectives who worked the case would struggle to speak about it without emotion. Michael Shaw, even in death, had been protecting his little girls. Within an hour, Michael Shaw's bedroom had been transformed into a hive of controlled chaos. Crime scene investigators from the Milwaukee Police Department's Forensic Services Unit arrived with their equipment, cameras, evidence bags, and years of experience reading the silent language of violence. Lead Detective Raymond Cooper, a 20-year veteran of the Homicide Unit, took charge of the investigation. Detective Cooper was known for his meticulous approach and his ability to see details that others missed. He stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, taking in the scene before him, letting the story reveal itself before the evidence was collected and the body removed. Every crime scene told a story if you knew how to listen. The first thing that struck Detective Cooper was the evidence of a struggle. The nightstand beside Michael's bed had been knocked over, a lamp shattered on the floor. A drinking glass that had apparently been on the nightstand was broken, water and ice cubes scattered across the carpet. One of Michael's shoes was lying near the door, the other still on his foot. This suggested Michael had been attacked suddenly, possibly while preparing for bed or perhaps after hearing a noise and getting up to investigate. The murder weapon was not immediately apparent at the scene. The blunt force trauma to Michael's head was severe, consistent with multiple strikes from something heavy and solid, but whatever had been used had been taken by the killer. The medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Lindstrom, who arrived at 10:30 a.m., made her preliminary assessment. Based on body temperature and rigor mortis, she estimated time of death between 11 p.m. on August 14th and 2 a.m. on August 15th. The exact time would be refined later with additional tests, but that window was the best estimate based on physical evidence. But there was something else, something that would prove to be the most critical piece of evidence in the entire case, though no one knew it at the time. Dr. Lindstrom, examining Michael's hands, noticed that his left hand was clenched tightly in a fist, the knuckles bruised and scraped. When she carefully opened the hand, she found what looked like tissue under several of his fingernails, particularly under the nails of his index and middle fingers. Michael had fought back. He had scratched his attacker, and in doing so, he had potentially captured his killer's DNA. This biological evidence was carefully collected, photographed, and preserved. Each fingernail was scraped separately, the material placed in sterile containers, labeled, and logged into evidence. The chain of custody began, a chain that would remain unbroken for the next 23 years until it finally led investigators to their suspect. The rest of the crime scene presented a puzzling picture. The front door was locked from the inside, the deadbolt engaged. The back door was also locked. That open kitchen window appeared to be the only point of entry or exit. It was a small window, only about 18 inches wide and 24 inches tall, but someone determined and agile could squeeze through it. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no damaged frame. Either the window had been left unlocked, or someone had managed to open it from outside without leaving obvious tool marks. Detective Cooper's team searched the entire house methodically. They fingerprinted every surface, photographed every room, collected every potential piece of evidence. In the living room, they found Michael's wallet lying on the coffee table. Curiously, it was open, and the cash was gone. Approximately $60 according to Michael's parents' recollection of how much he typically carried. But his credit cards were still there, his driver's license, everything else. This suggested a robbery, but it was a strange robbery. Why take only cash? Why not take the credit cards or the decent television in the living room or the laptop computer on the kitchen counter? Michael's cell phone was found on his nightstand, undamaged. There were no unusual calls or messages from the previous evening. The last text message he'd sent was to his father at 8:15 p.m. A simple message, "Girls asleep. Fixing that faucet now. Talk tomorrow." Everything had seemed normal, routine, right up until sometime later that night when violence shattered the peace of that yellow house on Elm Street. The house itself held other small mysteries. There was no sign of ransacking, no drawers pulled open, no closets disturbed. If this was a robbery, the intruder had known exactly where to find the wallet and had taken only the cash before fleeing. But if robbery was the motive, why attack Michael with such violence? The injuries suggested rage, anger, or panic, not the calculated action of a thief. Detective Cooper stood in the bedroom, looking down at Michael Shaw's body, and felt the familiar frustration of a case that didn't quite add up. The evidence pointed in multiple directions, suggesting different narratives. A robbery gone wrong? A targeted attack made to look like a robbery? Something personal that escalated to murder? The answers weren't clear, and that bothered him deeply. As the crime scene investigators worked inside the Shaw residence, uniformed officers fanned out across Elm Street, knocking on doors, asking questions, searching for anyone who had seen or heard anything unusual during the night of August 14th or the early morning of August 15th. In a neighborhood like this, where houses sat close together and people knew each other, someone must have noticed something. The canvass began at noon and continued throughout the day and into the evening. Detective Cooper personally interviewed several of Michael Shaw's closest neighbors, taking detailed notes, looking for any detail that might crack the case open. The interviews painted a picture of a quiet night, unremarkable in almost every way, which somehow made the violence that occurred even more disturbing. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, age 72, who lived directly across the street from the Shaw house, told Detective Cooper that she'd been watching television until about 10:30 p.m. the night before. She had noticed Michael's truck in the driveway when she closed her curtains before bed. She hadn't heard anything unusual. No shouting, no sounds of a struggle, nothing. She was a light sleeper, she insisted, and any loud noise would have woken her up. But the night had been quiet. Mr. James Rodriguez, who lived next door to Michael on the east side, reported that he'd been working a night shift and hadn't been home until 6 a.m. His wife and teenage son had been home, but both were heavy sleepers and had heard nothing. He mentioned that Michael had been a wonderful neighbor, always friendly, always willing to help. He couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hurt him. The family on the west side of Michael's house, the Johnsons, the same family whose house had caught fire and whom Michael had helped with the fundraiser, were devastated by the news. They'd been home all night. Their teenage daughter, Ashley, mentioned that she'd been on the phone with her boyfriend until midnight and had been in her room, which faced the Shaw house. She hadn't seen anything unusual, no strange cars, no one lurking around, just a normal, quiet night. As the interviews continued, a pattern emerged. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. It was as if the murder had occurred in complete silence, an impossibility given the evidence of a struggle. But perhaps the attack had been quick, the sounds muffled by walls and the ambient noise of a residential neighborhood at night, air conditioners humming, televisions playing, the ordinary sounds that mask extraordinary events. Then Detective Cooper spoke with a neighbor who would become a person of interest, though not a serious suspect at first. His name was David Chen, age 36, a quiet man who lived 4 houses down from Michael Shaw on the same side of the street. David had lived on Elm Street for about 8 years, having moved there in 1993. He worked from home as a freelance graphic designer and kept to himself mostly. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, the kind of person you'd wave to but not have long conversations with. David Chen told Detective Cooper that he'd been home alone the night of August 14th, working late on a project for a client. He'd been in his home office, which faced the backyard, not the street, so he hadn't seen any activity on Elm Street. He typically wore noise-canceling headphones when he worked, he explained, so he wouldn't have heard anything unusual either. He'd gone to bed around 1 a.m. and hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. He expressed shock at Michael Shaw's death, saying that while they weren't close friends, Michael had always been pleasant and helpful. Just last month, Michael had helped him carry some heavy boxes of equipment from his car into his house. Detective Cooper made notes of the conversation but didn't see any red flags. David Chen seemed genuinely surprised by the news, his demeanor calm and cooperative. He agreed to provide his fingerprints for elimination purposes, standard procedure when investigating everyone who had access to a crime scene area. Those fingerprints were taken, logged, and filed. They would sit in a folder for 23 years, never matching any prints found at the Shaw residence. Over the next several days, Detective Cooper and his team interviewed over 50 people. Neighbors, Michael's employees, Little League parents, friends from church, anyone who had been in contact with Michael Shaw in the weeks before his death. The picture that emerged was consistent. Michael was universally liked, had no known enemies, no disputes with anyone, no angry ex-girlfriends or business rivals. His life was an open book, and every page showed a man who lived simply, honestly, and kindly. The investigation into Michael's background revealed no dark secrets, no hidden debts, no risky behavior. His finances were modest but stable. His hardware store made a reasonable profit, enough to support his family and put a little away for the girls' college funds. He didn't gamble, didn't use drugs, drank only occasionally and socially. His late wife's medical bills had been paid off through insurance and community fundraising. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that suggested why anyone would want Michael Shaw dead. And yet someone had. Someone had entered his home in the dead of night, attacked him with brutal force, and left him dying on his bedroom floor. Someone had taken only $60 in cash and fled through a kitchen window. Someone who had left almost no trace except for those few cells of biological material under Michael Shaw's fingernails. Someone who had shattered a family and a community and then seemingly vanished into the night. The initial investigation was thorough, exhaustive even, but it was going nowhere. Every lead fizzled out. Every theory fell apart under scrutiny. The robbery angle made less sense the more they looked at it. The personal vendetta angle had no support, no suspects, no motive. The random attack by a stranger seemed unlikely given the lack of similar crimes in the area and the specific nature of the entry point. Detective Cooper worked the case for 6 months, following up on tips that came in through Crime Stoppers, re-interviewing witnesses, bringing in forensic consultants to review the evidence. The DNA collected from under Michael's fingernails was processed and entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes. No match. The DNA belonged to someone who had never been arrested, never had their DNA collected, never been in the system. Without a match, without a murder weapon, without a clear motive or suspect, the case began to cool. New homicides demanded attention and resources. The Michael Shaw case was moved from active investigation to cold case status in March 2002, just 7 months after the murder. Detective Cooper, who would retire in 2009, never forgot the case. He kept a copy of the case file in his home office, and on the anniversary of Michael's death each year, he'd pull it out and review it, hoping that something new would jump out at him, that he'd missed something obvious. He never did. The case remained a painful mystery, a professional failure that haunted him for the rest of his career. For Michael Shaw's family, the transition from active investigation to cold case status felt like a second death, a second abandonment. His parents, Robert and Dorothy Shaw, suddenly found themselves raising their 2 granddaughters, children who had lost their mother to cancer and their father to violence in the span of just a few years. Emma and Lily Shaw were now orphans, and the people responsible for protecting them from such trauma had been the elderly couple who should have been enjoying their retirement, not changing diapers and helping with algebra homework all over again. Robert Shaw was 64 years old when Michael died. Dorothy was 62. They were in decent health, but the emotional and physical toll of raising 2 traumatized children while grieving their own son was crushing. Dorothy would later tell reporters that there were nights when she'd lie awake, listening to one of the girls crying in their sleep, and she'd feel an anger so intense it frightened her. Not just anger at the person who killed Michael, but anger at God, at fate, at the universe for being so unspeakably cruel. The girls struggled in ways both visible and hidden. Emma, who had been 9 when her father died, became withdrawn and anxious. She was terrified of sleeping alone, convinced that someone would break into her room and hurt her. For years, she slept on a mattress on the floor of Lily's room, needing the presence of her sister to feel safe. She had nightmares regularly, dreams where she'd find her father and try to save him, only to watch him die over and over again. Therapy helped, but the scars went deep. Lily, younger by 2 years, dealt with her trauma differently. She became obsessed with locks and security. She checked the doors and windows in her grandparents' house multiple times before bed, a ritual that became compulsive. She insisted on security lights being installed outside. She'd panic if she heard unexpected noises at night. The world had proven itself to be a dangerous, unpredictable place, and Lily responded by trying to control every variable she could. Both girls excelled in school, perhaps because academics were something they could control, but they struggled socially. Other children didn't know how to talk to them about what had happened. Teachers treated them with a careful gentleness that marked them as different, as victims. They wore their tragedy like a visible scar, and it set them apart. They had each other, and they had their grandparents, but the loss of their father was a wound that never fully healed. As the years passed, Robert and Dorothy Shaw became advocates for cold case victims' families. They attended city council meetings, pushing for more funding for the cold case unit. They held annual vigils on the anniversary of Michael's death, gathering on Elm Street with neighbors and community members to light candles and remember a good man taken too soon. Local news stations would cover the vigils, especially on the 5-year and 10-year anniversaries, keeping Michael's story in the public consciousness. Dorothy Shaw gave interviews regularly, her message always the same: someone knows something, someone saw something. Please, if you have any information, come forward. Help us find justice for Michael. Help us give his daughters closure. Her face became familiar to Milwaukee residents, the grieving mother who refused to let her son's case be forgotten. The 10th anniversary vigil in 2011 was particularly emotional. Emma and Lily, now 19 and 17, spoke publicly for the first time about their father's murder. Emma, fighting back tears, told the assembled crowd, "I barely remember my dad's voice anymore. I have to watch old home videos to remember what he sounded like. But I remember how he made me feel. Safe, loved, important. Whoever took him from us took everything. They stole my childhood, my sister's childhood, our future with our father. And they're still out there, living their life while we're stuck in this nightmare." Lily, standing beside her sister, added, "We're not going to stop. We're never going to stop asking for justice. 20 years from now, 50 years from now, we'll still be asking. Because our dad deserves it. And because we need to know why. We need to know who did this and why they thought they had the right to destroy our family." The crowd that night numbered over 200 people, a testament to the community's enduring connection to the Shaw family and their loss. But as powerful as the vigil was, as much media attention as it generated, it didn't produce new leads. The case remained cold, the killer unidentified, the motive unknown. But the Shaw family didn't stop. They worked with other cold case families to create a nonprofit organization called Justice Delayed, Not Denied, which raised money to fund forensic testing of cold case evidence using new technologies. They lobbied the Wisconsin state legislature to pass laws mandating periodic review of cold case files and prioritizing DNA evidence testing. They became fixtures at law enforcement conferences, speaking about the importance of not giving up on old cases, of continuing to search for answers no matter how much time had passed. Robert Shaw lived to see the 15th anniversary of his son's death, but passed away from a heart attack in 2017 at age 80. His death was another blow to the family, another loss compounded by the unresolved grief over Michael. Dorothy insisted at his funeral that one of her husband's final wishes was to see Michael's killer brought to justice, and she vowed to continue fighting for that outcome for as long as she had breath in her body. And then, in early 2024, 23 years after Michael Shaw was murdered in his yellow house on Elm Street, Dorothy Shaw's phone rang with news that would change everything. In January 2024, the Milwaukee Police Department's cold case unit received a significant budget increase as part of a citywide initiative to address unsolved crimes using modern technology. The unit, which had been operating with just 3 detectives and limited resources, was suddenly able to expand its capabilities, hire additional personnel, and most importantly, allocate funds for advanced forensic testing of old evidence. Detective Laura Simmons, who had joined the cold case unit in 2022, was assigned to review a list of priority cases where DNA evidence had been collected but never fully analyzed using the latest techniques. The Michael Shaw homicide was on that list, flagged because of the biological material collected from under the victim's fingernails. That evidence had been tested back in 2001 using the technology available at the time, producing a DNA profile that was entered into Cody's but never matched to anyone. The evidence had then been properly stored and preserved, waiting for the day when technology might catch up to the mystery. Detective Simmons saw an opportunity. Forensic genealogy, the technique that had famously cracked the Golden State Killer case in 2018, had evolved significantly in the years since. By taking DNA evidence from a crime scene and uploading the profile to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, investigators could identify distant relatives of an unknown suspect. From there, using traditional genealogical research and investigation techniques, they could build a family tree that eventually narrowed down to potential suspects. It was revolutionary, game-changing technology that had already solved dozens of cold cases across the country. But it required funding, expertise, and time. With the new budget allocation, Detective Simmons now had all 3. She contacted Parban Nanolabs, a company specializing in forensic genealogy, and arranged for them to take the DNA profile from the Michael Shaw case and see if they could identify the person whose skin cells had been found under Michael's fingernails 23 years earlier. The process took several months. The DNA profile was uploaded to genealogy databases with law enforcement access. The system searched through millions of profiles, looking for genetic matches, even distant ones. In March 2024, Parabon's genetic genealogist, Dr. Rebecca Morrison, called Detective Simmons with exciting news. They had identified several third and fourth cousins of the unknown suspect. These were people who shared enough DNA with the suspect to indicate a family relationship, even though they might not know the suspect personally or even know of their existence. Dr. Morrison explained that from these distant relatives, she could begin building a family tree, tracing back through generations to find common ancestors, and then working forward through the branches to identify all the descendants of those ancestors. Somewhere in that tree would be the person whose DNA was under Michael Shaw's fingernails. It was painstaking work, requiring access to birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries, and any other genealogical records available. For 6 weeks, Dr. Morrison worked on the family tree, sometimes putting in 12-hour days, following leads, eliminating branches, narrowing down possibilities. She was building a genetic map that spanned over 100 years of family history, encompassing hundreds of individuals across multiple states. But gradually, the tree took shape, and the pool of potential suspects began to shrink. By late April, Dr. Morrison had narrowed the possibilities down to a dozen male individuals who fit the basic parameters. They were the right age in 2001, they had some connection to the Milwaukee area, and they were descendants of the common ancestors shared by the third and fourth cousins who had matched the crime scene DNA. Detective Simmons reviewed the list carefully, running background checks, looking for anyone who might have had a connection to Michael Shaw or lived in the vicinity of Elm Street in 2001. And that's when a name jumped off the page, a name that made Detective Simmons sit back in her chair and say out loud to the empty office, "No way, it can't be. David Chen, age 59, freelance graphic designer, resident of Elm Street, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, from 1993 to present. Living 4 doors down from Michael Shaw's house. Living there at the time of the murder. Living there still all these years later. The same David Chen who had been interviewed by Detective Raymond Cooper back in August 2001. The same David Chen who had expressed shock at Michael's death, who had cooperated with police, who had been fingerprinted and cleared. The same David Chen who had lived on that street for over 30 years. A quiet, invisible neighbor, unremarkable in every way. Detective Simmons pulled the original case file and found Detective Cooper's interview notes from August 15, 2001. David Chen had claimed to be home alone, working with noise-canceling headphones, seeing and hearing nothing. He had no alibi that could be verified, but he also had no apparent motive, no connection to Michael Shaw beyond being a distant neighbor. He'd been cooperative, polite, seemingly genuine. There had been no reason to suspect him of anything. But now, 23 years later, forensic genealogy was pointing directly at him. The DNA under Michael Shaw's fingernails, the DNA from the person Michael had fought with in those final terrible moments of his life, that DNA belonged to someone in David Chen's family line. And David Chen was the only person in that family line who lived on Elm Street in August 2001. Detective Simmons knew that genealogical evidence alone wasn't enough for an arrest. They needed more. They needed to confirm that the DNA specifically matched David Chen, not some other relative. To do that, they needed a fresh DNA sample from Chen himself, and they needed to obtain it without alerting him that he was under investigation. This would require careful planning, patience, and a bit of luck. A covert surveillance operation was initiated. For 3 weeks in May 2024, detectives discreetly followed David Chen, documenting his routine, looking for opportunities to collect a DNA sample through what's known as abandoned DNA. Any item that Chen discarded in a public place, anything he touched and left behind would be fair game. A coffee cup, a water bottle, a used tissue, anything with his saliva or skin cells on it could provide the confirmation they needed. David Chen's daily routine was remarkably consistent, almost ritualistic in its predictability. Every morning at 9 a.m., he'd leave his house and walk 3 blocks to a local coffee shop called the Daily Grind. He'd order the same thing every time: a medium dark roast coffee and a blueberry muffin. He'd sit at the same table by the window working on his laptop for about an hour, and then he'd walk back home. He rarely went anywhere else, ordering groceries online, working from home, living a solitary existence. On May 23, 2024, Detective Simmons and her partner, Detective Marcus Johnson, were conducting surveillance at the Daily Grind. They watched David Chen through the window, sitting at his usual table, sipping his coffee, typing on his laptop. He seemed completely at ease, unaware that his world was about to come crashing down. After finishing his coffee, Chen closed his laptop, gathered his things, and left the coffee shop. Behind him on the table, he left his empty coffee cup and the paper plate that had held his muffin. The moment he exited, Detective Simmons moved quickly. She entered the coffee shop, approached the table, and carefully collected the coffee cup and plate, placing them in evidence bags she'd concealed in her purse. The barista, who had been briefed earlier by the detectives and had agreed to cooperate, confirmed that no one else had touched those items. The chain of custody was established. They had David Chen's DNA. The cup and plate were rushed to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. The DNA profile extracted from David Chen's saliva on the coffee cup was compared to the DNA profile from the biological material found under Michael Shaw's fingernails in 2001. The forensic scientist who conducted the analysis called Detective Simmons 2 days later with the results. It was a match. Not a familial match, not a probable match. An exact match. The DNA on the coffee cup and the DNA from the crime scene were from the same person. David Chen had been there. David Chen had fought with Michael Shaw. David Chen's skin cells had been under Michael Shaw's fingernails. David Chen was the killer. After 23 years, they had him. With DNA confirmation in hand, Detective Simmons and her team began a deep dive into David Chen's life, searching for any clue that might explain why he had killed Michael Shaw. What they discovered was a portrait of a man who had perfected the art of invisibility. A man who had lived among neighbors for decades without anyone really knowing him at all. David Chen was born in 1965 in San Francisco, California, the only child of immigrants from Taiwan. His father had been an engineer, his mother a seamstress. By all accounts, his childhood had been unremarkable, middle-class, stable. He'd attended public schools, earned decent grades, showed an aptitude for art and computers. After high school, he'd attended a community college, studying graphic design, and had graduated with an associate degree in 1985. Chen had worked a series of freelance design jobs throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, never staying with any company for long, preferring the autonomy of freelance work. In 1993, at age 28, he'd moved to Milwaukee for reasons that weren't entirely clear. He told people he'd wanted a change of scenery, a lower cost of living, a quieter lifestyle. He'd purchased the house on Elm Street with money from an inheritance after his mother passed away, paying cash for the modest property. For the next 31 years, David Chen lived in that house, working from home, keeping to himself, maintaining minimal social contact. He had no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. He paid his taxes on time, kept his property maintained to a reasonable standard, didn't cause trouble. He was the kind of neighbor who was easy to forget, easy to overlook, easy to never really think about at all. But as detectives dug deeper, a more complex picture emerged. David Chen had no close friends, no romantic relationships that anyone could identify, no family connections after his father passed away in 2005. He belonged to no clubs, no organizations, no social groups. His interactions with neighbors over the years had been polite but minimal, surface-level exchanges about weather and yard work, never anything personal or deep. He existed on the periphery of the community, present but not really part of it. Former clients from his graphic design business described him as competent but difficult to work with, someone who was particular about his creative vision and resistant to feedback. Several mentioned that he had a temper that would occasionally flare up during projects, though he'd always apologize afterward and complete the work professionally. He'd lost clients over the years because of interpersonal conflicts, but he'd always managed to find new ones. His income was modest, enough to cover his expenses but not much more. Neighbors, when re-interviewed in May and June of 2024, recalled small incidents over the years that hadn't seemed significant at the time but took on new meaning in light of the investigation. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman across the street, remembered that David Chen had once yelled at neighborhood kids for cutting across his lawn, an outburst that had seemed disproportionate to the offense. The Johnsons recalled that Chen had complained about noise from Michael Shaw's Little League team practices, saying the children's voices bothered him when he was trying to work. Michael had apologized and made sure the kids kept the volume down. A typical Michael Shaw response, accommodating and kind. And then there was the property line dispute. This detail emerged from old city records and conversations with longtime neighbors. In 1999, there had been a disagreement between David Chen and the neighbor to his east about the exact location of the property line between their yards. Chen had insisted that a small strip of land, maybe 3 feet wide and 20 feet long, belonged to his property. The neighbor had disagreed. A surveyor had been called in, and the official measurement had supported the neighbor's claim. Chen had been forced to remove a section of fence he'd erected on what he believed was his land. Neighbors remembered that Chen had been furious about the outcome, ranting to anyone who would listen about the injustice, about how he'd been cheated, about how no one respected his rights. Michael Shaw, ever the peacemaker, had tried to mediate the situation, suggesting that both parties let it go and move forward as neighbors. Chen had apparently taken offense at Michael's involvement, viewing it as meddling in something that wasn't his business. Could this have been the motive? Could a petty property line dispute from 1999 have festered in David Chen's mind for 2 years, building into a resentment so intense that it led to murder in 2001? It seemed almost absurd, disproportionate beyond comprehension. But investigators who specialized in crimes of rage and obsession knew that seemingly minor grievances could consume certain personalities, growing in the darkness of isolation into justifications for violence. A psychological profile was constructed based on the available evidence. David Chen appeared to fit the pattern of an individual with poor social skills, difficulty maintaining relationships, and a tendency toward rumination and resentment. He had lived an increasingly isolated life, with minimal human connection and no emotional outlet. He may have developed a distorted sense of grievance, viewing perceived slights as major injustices, building narratives in his mind where he was the victim and others, like Michael Shaw, were the antagonists. The theory that emerged was this: David Chen, nursing a long-standing resentment toward Michael Shaw over the property line dispute and Michael's involvement in it, had decided to act on that resentment on the night of August 14, 2001. Perhaps there had been a recent encounter that reignited his anger, or perhaps the resentment had simply reached a breaking point. Chen had entered Michael's home through the unlocked kitchen window, something he might have known about from observing the house over the years. He'd confronted Michael, perhaps demanding an apology or acknowledgement of some perceived wrong. The confrontation had escalated into violence. Michael had fought back, scratching Chen's arm or hand, collecting the DNA evidence that would eventually identify him. Chen had struck Michael repeatedly with an object he'd brought or found in the house, causing the fatal injuries. To make it look like a robbery, he'd taken the cash from Michael's wallet and fled through the same window he'd entered. It was a theory that fit the evidence, but it was also deeply disturbing. If true, it meant that Michael Shaw had died over a 3-foot strip of grass and a bruised ego. It meant that a good man, a loving father, a pillar of his community, had been murdered because a neighbor couldn't let go of a minor slight from years earlier. It was senseless, tragic, and infuriating. But theories weren't enough. Detective Simmons needed more evidence to build a case that would hold up in court. With the DNA match confirmed, prosecutors authorized the next step: an arrest warrant for David Chen on charges of first-degree intentional homicide. On the morning of June 11, 2024, a Tuesday, the sun rose over Elm Street much as it had for decades, casting long shadows across lawns and illuminating the yellow house where Michael Shaw had once lived with his daughters. The current residents, a young family who had purchased the property in 2010, were unaware of the significance of this particular morning, unaware that history was about to come full circle just a few houses down. At 7 a.m., a convoy of police vehicles, marked and unmarked, quietly took positions around David Chen's residence. Detective Simmons, wearing a ballistic vest over her suit, held the arrest warrant in her hand. Beside her stood Detective Johnson and 6 uniformed officers, all prepared for the possibility that Chen might resist or attempt to flee. They had no reason to believe he was violent beyond the murder 23 years ago, but they took no chances. At 7:15 a.m., Detective Simmons approached the front door and knocked loudly, identifying herself as police. Inside, there was a long moment of silence, then the sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened, and David Chen stood there in pajamas and a bathrobe, looking confused and annoyed at the early morning intrusion. He was 59 years old now, his hair gray, his face lined with age, his posture slightly stooped. He looked like what he was, a middle-aged man living a quiet, solitary life. He did not look like a killer, but then killers rarely do. "David Chen," Detective Simmons said, though she knew the answer. "Yes, what is this about?" Chen responded, irritation clear in his voice. "David Chen, you are under arrest for the first-degree intentional homicide of Michael Shaw. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I have explained them to you?" For a moment, David Chen's face was completely blank, as if his mind was processing information that didn't compute. Then something shifted in his expression. A flicker of emotion, fear or recognition or resignation. It was hard to say. He didn't protest his innocence. He didn't ask what they were talking about. He simply said, quietly, "I want a lawyer." Officers moved in, gently but firmly turning Chen around, placing handcuffs on his wrists. He didn't resist. He was led out of his house, down the front steps and toward a waiting police car. And that's when the neighbors started to emerge from their homes, drawn by the unusual activity, the flashing lights, the cluster of police vehicles on their quiet street. Mrs. Peterson, now 95 years old and still living in her house across from where Michael Shaw had been murdered, stood on her porch, one hand over her mouth, watching in disbelief as David Chen was placed in the back of a police car. "That's David Chen," she said to her caregiver who stood beside her. "He's lived here forever. What on earth is happening?" Other neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, speaking in hushed tones, pulling out cell phones to record the scene and text friends and family. Within minutes, news vans began arriving, alerted by police scanners and tips from sources within the department. By 8 a.m., Elm Street was a media circus, reporters standing in front of cameras, describing the shocking arrest of a longtime resident in a cold case murder that had haunted the community for over 2 decades. At 9:30 a.m., Detective Simmons made a phone call she had been both dreading and anticipating. She called Dorothy Shaw, Michael's mother, now 84 years old, and told her that an arrest had been made in her son's murder. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Dorothy Shaw began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of grief so profound and long-held that its release was almost physical. She kept repeating, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," and Detective Simmons found herself wiping away tears as well. Emma and Lily Shaw, now 31 and 29 years old, received the news at their respective homes. Emma was living in Chicago, working as a social worker, married with a young son of her own. Lily was in Madison working as a high school teacher. Both dropped everything and immediately drove to Milwaukee to be with their grandmother. The 3 women, bound by the shared trauma of losing Michael, held each other and cried tears of relief, anger, grief, and a fragile sense of hope that justice might finally be served. The Milwaukee Police Department held a press conference that afternoon. Chief of Police Nathan Williams stood at a podium, flanked by Detective Simmons and the Milwaukee County District Attorney, Rebecca Martinez. Chief Williams explained that David Chen, age 59, a resident of Elm Street, had been arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide in the death of Michael Shaw, a case that had remained unsolved since 2001. He credited the break in the case to advances in forensic genealogy, the dedication of the cold case unit, and the preservation of DNA evidence by the original investigators. He thanked the Shaw family for their patience and their tireless advocacy for cold case victims. He acknowledged that while an arrest had been made, the case would now move through the judicial system, and everyone deserved a fair trial and the presumption of innocence. The media coverage was immediate and extensive. National news outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the angle of a neighbor who had lived just doors away from the victim for decades after committing the murder. The narrative was irresistible. The invisible man, hiding in plain sight, finally unmasked by science. Cable news shows debated the case, true crime podcasters recorded special episodes, online forums exploded with theories and discussions. On social media, former neighbors and acquaintances of David Chen expressed shock and disbelief. Several described him as odd or a loner, but insisted they'd never imagined him capable of violence. Others claimed, with the clarity of hindsight, that they'd always known something was off about him, engaging in the common human tendency to rewrite memory to align with new information. But for those who had known Michael Shaw, for the family who had mourned him for 23 years, for the community that had held vigils and never forgotten, the arrest wasn't entertainment or content, it was the beginning of the end of a nightmare. It was the possibility of answers, of closure, of justice delayed but not denied. And now, all eyes turned to the courtroom, where David Chen would face the consequences of a brutal act committed on a summer night in 2001. In the weeks following David Chen's arrest, the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office began building what they believed was an overwhelming case for conviction. Lead prosecutor Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Wu was assigned to the case, a veteran prosecutor with a reputation for meticulous preparation and compelling courtroom presentations. She knew this case would be closely watched, not just by the Milwaukee community but nationally, and she was determined to secure justice for Michael Shaw and his family. The cornerstone of the prosecution's case was, of course, the DNA evidence. The match between the biological material found under Michael Shaw's fingernails and David Chen's DNA, as confirmed by the sample collected from the coffee cup, was extraordinarily strong. The forensic expert who would testify, Dr. Alan Schneider, was prepared to explain to the jury that the probability of the DNA belonging to someone other than David Chen was less than 1 in several trillion. It was, in scientific terms, a virtual certainty. But ADA Wu knew that while DNA evidence was powerful, juries needed context and narrative. They needed to understand not just that David Chen's DNA was at the crime scene, but how it got there and why. The defense would certainly argue for innocent explanations, contamination, or error. Wu needed to build a story that eliminated those possibilities and pointed to one inescapable conclusion. David Chen had murdered Michael Shaw. The prosecution's theory of the case centered on the property line dispute from 1999 and subsequent interactions between Chen and Shaw. While no one could definitively prove what happened inside Michael Shaw's bedroom on the night of August 14, 2001, the evidence suggested a confrontation that escalated to violence. The prosecution planned to argue that Chen, harboring resentment toward Shaw, had entered the residence through the unlocked kitchen window with the intention of confronting him. The confrontation had become physical. Shaw had fought back, scratching Chen and collecting the DNA evidence, and Chen had struck Shaw repeatedly with a blunt object, causing fatal head trauma. To support this theory, the prosecution would present, first, testimony from neighbors about the property line dispute and Chen's documented anger about the outcome, establishing motive. Second, testimony from other neighbors about Chen's occasional complaints about noise from Shaw's property and his general demeanor of social isolation and resentment. Third, expert testimony from Dr. Sarah Lindstrom, the medical examiner, about the nature of Shaw's injuries, the evidence of a struggle, and the significance of the biological material under the victim's fingernails. Fourth, testimony from the lead detective in 2001, Raymond Cooper, now retired but willing to return to testify about the original investigation and his interview with David Chen, in which Chen claimed to have heard and seen nothing despite living just 4 doors away. Fifth, expert testimony from Dr. Rebecca Morrison, the genetic genealogist, explaining how forensic genealogy identified Chen as a suspect and how that led to the confirmatory DNA sample. Sixth, testimony from Dr. Alan Schneider about the DNA match and the statistical certainty of the identification. Seventh, testimony from Detective Laura Simmons about the collection of the coffee cup DNA sample and the subsequent investigation. And finally, The prosecution would present the original case file evidence: crime scene photographs, diagrams of the Shaw residence, the police reports from August 2001, and the testimony of the officers who discovered Michael Shaw's body. The defense, led by public defender Thomas Brennan, a skilled attorney known for his aggressive cross-examination style, faced a formidable challenge. The DNA evidence was, on its face, nearly impossible to refute. But Brennan's job was to create reasonable doubt, to offer alternative explanations, to challenge the prosecution's narrative. He filed several pretrial motions, arguing that the DNA evidence should be excluded because it was collected without a warrant when Chen discarded the coffee cup in a public place. The motion was denied. The judge ruled that abandoned DNA in a public setting was legally obtainable by law enforcement. Brennan's defense strategy, as outlined in pretrial hearings, would focus on several points. First, he'd argue that the DNA evidence only proved that Chen had physical contact with Shaw at some point, not necessarily on the night of the murder. Perhaps Chen and Shaw had a friendly interaction days or weeks before. Perhaps they shook hands. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation for the DNA transfer. Second, he'd question the chain of custody of the evidence over 23 years, suggesting the possibility of contamination or degradation. Third, he'd point out that no murder weapon was ever found, that no physical evidence tied Chen to the interior of Shaw's home beyond the DNA, and that the prosecution's theory about the property line dispute as motive was speculative and unsupported by direct evidence. Fourth, he'd argue that Chen had cooperated with police in 2001, had provided fingerprints, and had no criminal history, suggesting he was an unlikely suspect for a violent crime. And finally, he'd emphasize that Chen was entitled to the presumption of innocence and that the burden of proof rested entirely with the prosecution. In October 2024, after months of pretrial preparation, motions, and negotiations, the trial of State of Wisconsin v. David Chen began in Milwaukee County Circuit Court. Judge Patricia Alvarez, a respected jurist with over 20 years on the bench, presided. The courtroom was packed with media, members of the Shaw family, community members, and legal observers. Emma and Lily Shaw sat in the front row directly behind the prosecution's table, their grandmother Dorothy beside them, frail but determined to see the trial through to its conclusion. David Chen, dressed in a suit provided by his attorney, sat at the defense table, his expression neutral, almost blank. He had declined to speak to the media or make any public statements. His demeanor throughout the proceedings would be one of detachment, as if he were observing events happening to someone else rather than participating in his own trial for murder. Jury selection took 3 days, a process of weeding out individuals who had strong pre-existing opinions about the case or couldn't commit to evaluating the evidence fairly. 12 jurors and 3 alternates were eventually seated, a mix of ages, backgrounds, and life experiences. 12 ordinary citizens tasked with the extraordinary responsibility of determining David Chen's guilt or innocence in a murder committed over 2 decades earlier. On the morning of October 21, 2024, ADA Jennifer Wu stood before the jury and delivered her opening statement. She spoke for 45 minutes, laying out the prosecution's case in clear, compelling terms. She began by introducing Michael Shaw not as a victim or a case file, but as a human being, a father, a business owner, a neighbor, a good man whose life was violently cut short. She showed the jury a photograph of Michael with his daughters, smiling, happy, alive. She wanted the jury to see the person behind the crime, to understand what was lost. Then she walked the jury through the events of August 2001, the discovery of Michael's body, the investigation, the collection of DNA evidence, and the eventual cold case status when no suspect could be identified. She explained how the case remained unsolved for 23 years until advances in forensic genealogy provided the breakthrough that led investigators to David Chen, the quiet neighbor who had lived just down the street all along. She described the covert collection of the confirmatory DNA sample and the overwhelming statistical certainty of the match. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wu said, her voice steady and clear, "the evidence in this case will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that David Chen murdered Michael Shaw. Michael's own body, his own DNA evidence collected from under his fingernails as he fought for his life, will identify his killer. Science will give Michael Shaw a voice from beyond the grave, and that voice will say, David Chen did this. David Chen took my life. And now, finally, after 23 years, David Chen must face justice. The defense's opening statement, delivered by Thomas Brennan, lasted just 15 minutes. He urged the jury to keep an open mind, to scrutinize the evidence carefully, to question the prosecution's assumptions and theories. He reminded them that DNA evidence could be transferred innocently, that the absence of a murder weapon and other physical evidence was significant, and that the burden of proof was on the prosecution to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, not on the defense to prove innocence. It was a competent opening, but the tone was unmistakably defensive, the challenge ahead clear. The trial would last 3 weeks, a parade of witnesses, evidence, and testimony that would paint a comprehensive picture of a murder, an investigation, and a breakthrough that finally brought a cold case to its conclusion. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks of testimony, each witness adding another piece to the puzzle, building a narrative that was difficult to dispute. The early witnesses established the foundation, the discovery of Michael Shaw's body, the condition of the crime scene, and the initial investigation. Officer Jennifer Martinez, now a sergeant, took the stand and described in detail the welfare check on August 15, 2001, the discovery of Michael's body, and the subsequent realization that his daughters were safe at their grandparents' home. Her testimony was professional, precise, and emotional when she described the moment they found Michael. Dr. Sarah Lindstrom, the medical examiner who had performed the autopsy on Michael Shaw, testified about the injuries he sustained. She explained that Michael had suffered multiple blunt force trauma injuries to his head, causing skull fractures and fatal brain hemorrhaging. The injuries were consistent with being struck repeatedly with a heavy object. She also testified about the defensive wounds on Michael's hands and the significance of the biological material found under his fingernails, indicating he had scratched his attacker. The jury was shown autopsy photographs, graphic images that caused several jurors to look away and Emma Shaw to quietly leave the courtroom for a few minutes. These were not just medical evidence. They were a stark reminder of the violence inflicted on a man who had been sleeping in his own home, a father who should have been safe. Retired Detective Raymond Cooper took the stand, now 73 years old but still sharp in his recollections. He walked the jury through the original investigation, the interviews with neighbors, the collection of evidence, and the frustrating lack of viable suspects. When asked about his interview with David Chen in August 2001, Cooper referred to his notes and confirmed that Chen had claimed to be home alone, working with headphones on, and had noticed nothing unusual. Chen had been cooperative, had volunteered his fingerprints, and had shown no obvious signs of deception or guilt. "Did you have any reason to suspect Mr. Chen at that time?" Edie Wu asked. "No," Cooper replied. "He was just another neighbor I was interviewing. There was nothing that stood out about him." "And where was Mr. Chen's residence in relation to Michael Shaw's house?" "4 houses down on the same side of the street, about 200 feet away." The implication was clear. The killer had been right there, had spoken to police, had been dismissed as just another neighbor, and had then continued living on that street for over 2 decades. The audacity of it, the cold-blooded nerve, was chilling. The most anticipated testimony came from Dr. Rebecca Morrison, the genetic genealogist from Parabon Nanolabs. She spent an entire day on the stand, explaining in accessible terms how forensic genealogy works. She described the process of uploading the crime scene DNA profile to genealogy databases, identifying distant relatives, building family trees, and eventually narrowing down to David Chen as the most likely source of the DNA. She showed the jury diagrams of the family tree she had constructed, a complex web of relationships that all pointed to one person. On cross-examination, Thomas Brennan pressed Dr. Morrison on the reliability of the technique, suggesting that genetic genealogy was still a relatively new and unproven method. Dr. Morrison calmly explained that forensic genealogy had been used successfully in hundreds of cases, had been validated by peer-reviewed research, and had led to numerous convictions that had been upheld on appeal. The technique wasn't experimental, it was established science. But the most powerful testimony came from Dr. Alan Schneider, the DNA forensic expert. He explained to the jury, using charts and graphs to illustrate his points, how DNA comparison works. He described the confirmatory DNA sample collected from David Chen's discarded coffee cup and how it was compared to the DNA profile from the biological material under Michael Shaw's fingernails. The match, he testified, was exact across 23 genetic markers, a match so precise that the statistical probability of it being a coincidence was less than 1 in 6 trillion. To put that in perspective, Dr. Schneider said, "There are only about 8 billion people on Earth. The probability of this DNA matching someone other than David Chen is less than the probability of randomly selecting one specific grain of sand from all the beaches in the world." Ada Wu asked the critical question, "Dr. Schneider, based on your analysis of the DNA evidence, do you have an opinion, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, about whether the DNA found under Michael Shaw's fingernails came from the defendant, David Chen?" "Yes, I do." "And what is that opinion?" "The DNA found under Michael Shaw's fingernails came from David Chen. There is no reasonable scientific doubt about that conclusion." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Emma Shaw crying softly. This was the moment, the scientific certainty that her father had identified his own killer, that the DNA evidence Michael had fought to collect in those final terrible moments was now speaking for him, 23 years later. On cross-examination, Thomas Brennan did his best to challenge Dr. Schneider's conclusions. He asked about the possibility of contamination, about the degradation of DNA evidence over time, about the chain of custody. Dr. Schneider addressed each concern methodically. The evidence had been properly collected, stored in climate-controlled conditions, and handled according to strict protocols. The DNA profile had been generated using modern techniques less susceptible to contamination. The chain of custody was documented and unbroken. Every question had an answer, every doubt had a rebuttal. Brennan then attempted to suggest innocent explanations for the DNA transfer. Perhaps Chen and Shaw had shaken hands at some community event, and the DNA had transferred that way. Dr. Schneider explained that DNA under fingernails, particularly in the quantity found, was consistent with scratching during a physical struggle, not with casual contact. The location and amount of the biological material supported the prosecution's theory of a violent confrontation, not a friendly handshake. The prosecution also called several neighbors to testify about David Chen's demeanor and his interactions with Michael Shaw. Mrs. Peterson testified about Chen's occasional displays of anger, his complaints about noise, and his general tendency to keep to himself. A former neighbor who had been involved in the 1999 property line dispute testified about Chen's reaction when the surveyor ruled against him, describing Chen as obsessed and unreasonably angry about the outcome. Another neighbor testified that Chen had once made a comment about Michael Shaw being a busybody who couldn't mind his own business, a reference to Shaw's attempt to mediate the property dispute. While none of this testimony directly proved that Chen had murdered Shaw, it established a pattern of resentment, a psychological foundation for the prosecution's motive theory. The prosecution rested its case after 11 days of testimony. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. DNA science had spoken, and it had identified David Chen as the person whose skin cells were under Michael Shaw's fingernails. The only question remaining was whether the jury would believe the science and convict, or whether the defense could create enough doubt to avoid a guilty verdict. The defense case was brief, lasting only 3 days compared to the prosecution's 2 weeks. Thomas Brennan called fewer than a dozen witnesses, most of them character witnesses who testified that David Chen had been a quiet, non-violent man in the years they'd known him. Former clients testified that while Chen could be difficult to work with, he'd never been physically aggressive. A former landlord from Chen's San Francisco days testified that Chen had been a reliable tenant who paid rent on time and caused no problems. But the defense faced a fundamental challenge. How do you refute DNA evidence? The answer, in most cases, is that you can't. You can only try to create doubt about how it got there or what it means. Brennan attempted to do just that, calling his own DNA expert, Dr. Lisa Hartman, to testify about the limitations of DNA analysis and the possibilities of contamination or transfer. Dr. Hartman testified that while DNA evidence is powerful, it's not infallible. She raised questions about the handling of the evidence in 2001, suggesting that protocols in place back then were less rigorous than modern standards. She pointed out that DNA can be transferred through secondary contact, such as touching an object that someone else had touched. Perhaps, she suggested, David Chen's DNA had gotten onto Michael Shaw's hands through some innocent means days or weeks before the murder, and Shaw simply hadn't washed his hands thoroughly. On cross-examination, Ada Wu methodically dismantled these arguments. She asked Dr. Hartman about the specific location of the DNA under the fingernails and whether that was consistent with secondary transfer. Dr. Hartman conceded that it was less likely but still possible. Wu then asked about the quantity of biological material, whether a casual secondary transfer would result in enough material to generate a full DNA profile. Dr. Hartman admitted it would be unusual. With each answer, the defense experts' alternative theories seemed less plausible, less likely, less believable. The most significant decision in the defense case was whether David Chen himself would testify. In the American criminal justice system, defendants have the absolute right not to testify, and the jury is instructed not to draw any negative inference from that decision. After lengthy consultations with his attorney, Chen chose not to take the stand. He would not tell his version of events, would not explain how his DNA got under Michael Shaw's fingernails, would not account for his actions on August 14, 2001. His silence spoke volumes, though legally it proved nothing. After the defense rested, both sides prepared their closing arguments, the final opportunity to address the jury before deliberations began. On November 8, 2024, Ada Jennifer Wu stood before the jury one last time. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about science, justice, and truth. 23 years ago, Michael Shaw fought for his life in his own bedroom. As he fought, as he struggled against the person who was attacking him, he did something that would ultimately identify his killer. He scratched that person, collecting their DNA under his fingernails. That DNA, preserved and analyzed, has told us who murdered Michael Shaw. That DNA belongs to David Chen. Wu walked the jury through the evidence again, piece by piece, building the narrative. She addressed the defense's contamination theories directly, explaining why they didn't fit the facts. She talked about the location and quantity of the DNA, the chain of custody, the overwhelming statistical certainty of the match. She reminded the jury of the testimonies they'd heard, the neighbors who described Chen's resentment toward Shaw, the evidence of the property dispute, the pattern of anger and social isolation. The defense wants you to believe that this DNA got there innocently, that it's all just a coincidence. But ask yourselves, what are the odds? David Chen lived 4 doors down from Michael Shaw. Chen had expressed anger toward Shaw. Chen had access to the neighborhood, knew Shaw's routines. And Chen's DNA, not someone else's DNA, but his DNA specifically, was found under Michael Shaw's fingernails after a violent struggle. That is not coincidence. That is evidence. That is proof. Wu concluded by talking about Michael Shaw, about his daughters who grew up without their father, about his parents who never stopped fighting for justice, about a community that had been traumatized by an unsolved murder for over 2 decades. She reminded the jury that their duty was to follow the evidence wherever it led. And in this case, the evidence led directly to David Chen. Michael Shaw fought for his life, Wu said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. And in doing so, he gave us the tool to find his killer. Now, after 23 years, we can finally give Michael justice. We can tell Emma and Lily that their father's voice has been heard. We can tell Dorothy that her son's death will not go unpunished. David Chen murdered Michael Shaw. The evidence proves it beyond any reasonable doubt, and I'm asking you to return a verdict of guilty. Thomas Brennan's closing argument was a valiant effort in the face of overwhelming evidence. He reminded the jury of the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, and the requirement of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. He argued that while the DNA evidence was compelling, it didn't tell the whole story. It didn't prove when the DNA was transferred or how or under what circumstances. He emphasized that no murder weapon had been found, no eyewitnesses had come forward, no confession had been obtained. The prosecution wants you to believe that a property line dispute from 1999 led to murder in 2001, Brennan said. Does that make sense? Does that seem like a proportional response? Or is it possible that there's another explanation, one we don't fully understand, for how this DNA evidence came to be? The burden is on the prosecution to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. If you have doubt, if you think there might be another explanation, then you must vote not guilty. But even as he spoke, the defense attorney seemed to understand the uphill battle he faced. The DNA evidence was simply too strong, too scientifically certain, too conclusive. Unless the jury was willing to reject the validity of DNA science entirely, conviction seemed inevitable. Judge Alvarez provided the jury with detailed instructions on the law, explaining the definition of first-degree intentional homicide, the concept of reasonable doubt, and their duties as jurors. At 2:30 p.m. on November 8, 2024, the jury retired to the deliberation room to begin their discussions. Now all that remained was to wait. The jury deliberated for 7 hours and 23 minutes, spanning parts of 2 days. On the morning of November 9, 2024, word came that a verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled quickly, reporters rushing to secure seats, the Shaw family taking their places, David Chen being brought from the holding cell to the defense table. The atmosphere was electric with tension, the culmination of 23 years of grief, investigation, and legal process all converging on this single moment. Judge Alvarez took the bench, and the jury filed into the courtroom. Their faces were serious, unreadable, showing the weight of the decision they'd made. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman who worked as an accountant, held the verdict form in her hand. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Alvarez asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. "Please hand the verdict form to the bailiff." The bailiff took the form and delivered it to Judge Alvarez, who reviewed it silently, her expression neutral. She then handed it back to the bailiff, who returned it to the foreperson. "Will the defendant please rise?" David Chen and Thomas Brennan stood. Chen's face was pale but still largely expressionless, his hands clasped in front of him. "Members of the jury, have you reached a unanimous verdict in the case of State of Wisconsin versus David Chen?" "Yes, Your Honor, we have." "On the charge of first-degree intentional homicide, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, David Chen, guilty." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of reactions. Emma Shaw collapsed into her sister's arms, sobbing. Lily held her, tears streaming down her face as well. Dorothy Shaw, sitting beside her granddaughters, closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank God, thank God, thank God," over and over. Behind them, community members who had attended the trial, who had known Michael Shaw, who had followed the case for years, wiped away tears and embraced each other. At the defense table, David Chen showed the first real emotion he'd displayed throughout the entire trial. His shoulders slumped, his head dropped, and for just a moment, he looked like a man who finally understood that his past had caught up with him, that the secret he'd carried for 23 years was now public knowledge, and that his life as he'd known it was over. Judge Alvarez thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. She set a sentencing hearing for December 15, 2024, giving the defense time to prepare sentencing arguments and the Shaw family time to prepare victim impact statements. David Chen was remanded into custody immediately, led from the courtroom by deputies, disappearing through a side door to begin his journey into the prison system. Outside the courthouse, ADA Jennifer Wu held a brief press conference, flanked by Detective Laura Simmons and representatives from the Shaw family. "Today, justice was served," Wu said to the assembled media. Michael Shaw's voice, through the DNA evidence he collected as he fought for his life, has spoken. His killer has been identified and convicted. This case demonstrates that no matter how much time passes, we will never stop seeking justice for victims and their families. Advances in science have given us new tools, and we will use those tools to solve cold cases and bring closure to families who have waited far too long. Detective Simmons added, "This conviction is the result of excellent work by multiple generations of law enforcement professionals. The detectives who worked the case in 2001 collected and preserved evidence that made this conviction possible 23 years later. That foresight and professionalism cannot be overstated. I'm honored to have played a role in bringing this case to its conclusion." Emma Shaw, speaking on behalf of her family, addressed the media with remarkable composure. "Today doesn't bring my father back. It doesn't erase 23 years of grief and unanswered questions. But it does give us something we haven't had in a very long time: closure. We know who killed our dad. We know he's been held accountable. And we know that our father fought back, that even in his final moments, he was trying to protect us by leaving evidence that would eventually lead to his killer. We're grateful to everyone who never gave up on this case. And we hope other cold case families know that justice is possible, even after decades. On December 15, 2024, the courtroom reconvened for the sentencing hearing. Under Wisconsin law, first-degree intentional homicide carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment, but the judge has discretion over whether parole eligibility is possible and, if so, when. The hearing was an opportunity for the Shaw family to make victim impact statements and for David Chen, if he chose, to address the court. Dorothy Shaw, now 85 years old and visibly frail, was helped to the witness stand by her granddaughters. She spoke slowly, her voice shaking but determined. She talked about the day she learned her son was dead, the worst day of her life. She talked about raising Emma and Lily, watching them grow up without their father, seeing them struggle with trauma and loss. She talked about her late husband Robert, who had died without ever seeing justice for his son's murder. "David Chen, you didn't just kill my son," Dorothy said, looking directly at the defendant. "You killed a part of all of us. You stole Michael's future, his daughter's childhoods, and my golden years with my son. For 23 years you lived your life while we lived in hell, not knowing who had done this or why. And you were right there, just down the street, watching us grieve, watching us suffer. How could you? How could you live with yourself?" Chen stared at the table in front of him, not meeting her eyes. Emma Shaw spoke next, her voice stronger than her grandmother's, but filled with barely contained rage. "I'm 31 years old. I barely remember my dad's voice. I have to watch videos to remember what he sounded like, what his laugh sounded like. I got married 2 years ago, and my dad wasn't there to walk me down the aisle. I had a son last year, and my dad will never meet his grandson. Every milestone of my life has been marked by absence, by a hole that can never be filled. And you caused that, Mr. Chen. You took a hammer or whatever you used, and you beat my father to death over what? Property dispute? Your pride? It's incomprehensible. It's monstrous." Lily Shaw's statement was shorter but equally powerful. "I became a teacher because my dad believed in helping kids reach their potential. Every day, I try to embody the values he taught me. Kindness, generosity, community. But I also live every day with the trauma of what you did. I'm hypervigilant about security. I struggle with trust. I have nightmares. You didn't just kill my father that night, you damaged everyone who loved him. I hope you spend every single day of the rest of your life thinking about what you did and the pain you caused." Then, in a surprising turn, David Chen asked to address the court. His attorney advised against it, but Chen insisted. He stood, his wrists shackled, and for the first time since his arrest, he spoke publicly about the case. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet, barely audible. "I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for the pain I caused. There's no excuse, no justification. I was angry, and I let that anger control me, and I did something terrible. I've lived with the guilt every day since, and I'll live with it for the rest of my life. I know nothing I say can fix this, but I want the Shaw family to know that I am truly, deeply sorry." It was a confession, the first time Chen had admitted to the murder. Some observers speculated that he confessed because the conviction had made denial pointless, or perhaps because he genuinely felt remorse after hearing the victim impact statements. Whatever the reason, his words provided a final confirmation of guilt beyond the DNA evidence. Judge Alvarez then delivered her sentencing decision. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, reviewing the facts of the case, the severity of the crime, and the impact on the victims. She acknowledged Chen's expression of remorse but noted that it came only after conviction, only after he'd been caught and held accountable. "Mr. Chen," Judge Alvarez said, "you committed one of the most serious crimes in our legal system. You took the life of another human being, a good man, a father, a member of your community. You did so in a manner that was brutal and violent. And then you hid that crime for 23 years, living in the same neighborhood, passing by the very house where you committed murder, watching the victim's family suffer, and saying nothing. That demonstrates a profound moral failure, a level of selfishness and callousness that is difficult to comprehend. She continued, "The law requires that I sentence you to life imprisonment. The question is whether you should ever be eligible for parole. In making that determination, I consider the nature of the crime, your lack of criminal history, your expression of remorse, and the needs of society and the victims. I find that the aggravating factors in this case far outweigh any mitigating factors. The harm you caused is immeasurable and irreversible. Therefore, it is the sentence of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Wisconsin Department of Corrections for the remainder of your natural life, without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your days in prison, Mr. Chen. That is the consequence of your actions." The gavel came down. David Chen was led from the courtroom for the final time. The Shaw family embraced, their long wait for justice finally at an end. After 23 years, the cold case of Michael Shaw was closed. The man who had killed him had been identified, convicted, and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. The resolution of Michael Shaw's murder reverberated far beyond the Milwaukee courtroom where David Chen was sentenced. It became a nationally recognized example of how advances in forensic science, particularly genetic genealogy, were revolutionizing cold case investigations. Law enforcement agencies across the country took note, and many began reviewing their own cold case files to identify cases where DNA evidence existed but had never been matched using traditional databases. In Wisconsin, the state legislature passed the Michael Shaw Cold Case Act in 2025, allocating additional funding specifically for forensic genetic genealogy analysis of unsolved homicides and sexual assaults. The law also mandated that all law enforcement agencies in the state review cold cases at least once every 5 years using the latest available technology. It was a legislative legacy that turned tragedy into meaningful change, ensuring that other families might find the answers and justice that the Shaw family had finally received. The Justice Delayed, Not Denied organization, which Dorothy Shaw and her granddaughters had helped found, saw a surge in donations and support following the verdict. The organization expanded its mission, not only raising money for forensic testing, but also providing support services for cold case families, connecting them with resources, therapists, and legal advocates. Emma Shaw took a leadership role in the organization, using her experience as a social worker to help other families navigate the complex emotional landscape of seeking justice for a murdered loved one. Detective Laura Simmons became a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences, sharing her experience with the Shaw case and advocating for the use of forensic genealogy in cold case investigations. She emphasized the importance of evidence preservation, noting that the Shaw case was only solved because the original investigators in 2001 had properly collected and stored the DNA evidence. "Every piece of evidence you collect could be the key to solving a case decades from now," she told audiences of police officers and detectives. "Treat every case like it might be cold one day, because the technology that solves it might not exist yet." In Milwaukee, the resolution of the Shaw case brought a measure of closure to a community that had been haunted by the unsolved murder for over 2 decades. The yellow house on Elm Street where Michael Shaw had lived and died was now occupied by a young family with children of their own. They knew the history of the house, knew what had happened there, but they also saw it as a place to build new memories, new life, a testament to resilience and hope. David Chen's house, for doors down, was sold after his conviction. The new owners painted it a different color, remodeled the interior, and worked to erase the association with the man who had committed such a terrible act. Neighbors no longer pointed it out as the house where that murderer lived, but rather as simply another home on a street that had seen darkness but had emerged into light. The case also sparked broader discussions about the nature of evil, the psychology of murderers, and the banality of violence. David Chen wasn't a monster in appearance or demeanor. He was an ordinary man, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of person you'd walk past without a second glance. And yet he had committed an act of brutal violence and had lived with that secret for 23 years, functioning in society, interacting with the people who lived near the scene of his crime. It was a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs, that danger can exist in the most mundane places, and that the person living next door might be carrying secrets you could never imagine. The use of forensic genealogy in the Shaw case also raised important ethical and legal questions. While most people agreed that using DNA to solve violent crimes was justified, privacy advocates expressed concerns about the implications of law enforcement accessing public genealogy databases. They worried about the potential for misuse, for surveillance, for the erosion of genetic privacy. These debates would continue long after David Chen's conviction, shaping policies and regulations around the use of genetic information in criminal investigations. But for the Shaw family, these broader debates were secondary to the personal impact of the resolution. Emma Shaw, in an interview a year after the conviction, reflected on what justice meant to her and her family. "It doesn't bring my dad back," she said. "Nothing can do that. But it gives us answers. We know who did it and why, or at least as much of the why as we'll ever know. We know he's being held accountable. And maybe most importantly, we know my dad fought back, that he didn't just give up. He collected the evidence that eventually identified his killer. In a way, even in death, he was still protecting us, still making sure that one day, the truth would come out. That means everything to us." The story of Michael Shaw's murder and the eventual conviction of David Chen is a story about many things: the persistence of justice, the power of science, the resilience of a family, and the determination of investigators who refuse to let cold cases remain cold. It's a reminder that time doesn't erase crimes, that evidence can speak across decades, and that families who refuse to give up can achieve justice, no matter how long it takes. For every cold case that's solved, there are dozens that remain unsolved, families that continue to wait, questions that remain unanswered. But the Shaw case offers hope. It demonstrates that advances in technology are giving law enforcement new tools to revisit old evidence, to ask new questions, to find answers that were previously impossible to obtain. It shows that the phrase cold case doesn't mean closed case, that as long as evidence exists and people care enough to investigate, there's always a chance for resolution. Detectives like Laura Simmons continue to work through cold case files, applying new techniques to old mysteries. Organizations like Justice Delayed, Not Denied continue to advocate for victims and their families. And families like the Shaws continue to fight, not just for their own justice, but for the countless others who still wait for answers. The cold case of Michael Shaw is now solved, but its impact continues. It's a case that will be studied in law enforcement academies, discussed in ethics classes, and remembered by a community that learned a painful lesson about the hidden dangers that can exist in the most ordinary places. It's a case that transformed a family's grief into advocacy, a killer's secret into a public reckoning, and a decades-old mystery into a testament to the power of never giving up. As we close this chapter on the Michael Shaw cold case, it's important to step back and consider what this case teaches us about justice, community, and the nature of truth. This wasn't just a story about DNA evidence or investigative techniques, though those elements were crucial. It was a story about people, real people whose lives were forever altered by a single act of violence on a summer night in 2001. Michael Shaw was a real person with hopes and dreams, a man who coached Little League and helped his neighbors and worked hard to provide for his daughters. Emma and Lily Shaw are real young women who grew up without their father, who carry the scars of trauma and loss, but who have also found the strength to advocate for others. Dorothy Shaw is a real grandmother who buried her husband without seeing justice for her son, but who lived long enough to finally get that justice. These aren't characters in a story. They're human beings whose experiences remind us of the very real costs of violent crime. And David Chen, though convicted and sentenced, is also a real person, someone who made a terrible choice that destroyed multiple lives, including his own. His case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about resentment, isolation, and how ordinary people can commit extraordinary acts of violence. It reminds us that the capacity for harm exists in all of us, and that vigilance against our own worst impulses is a constant necessity. The resolution of this case after 23 years is remarkable, but it's not unique. Across the United States, there are thousands of cold cases waiting for similar breakthroughs. According to the FBI, there are over 250,000 unsolved murders in the United States, cases that have gone cold, families that still wait for answers. Each one of those cases represents a person who deserves justice, a family that deserves closure, a community that deserves to know the truth. If you take anything away from Michael Shaw's story, let it be this: these cases matter. These families matter. The passage of time doesn't diminish the importance of seeking justice or the value of answering questions that have lingered for years or decades. Whether you're in law enforcement and you have the power to investigate these cases, or you're a citizen who might have information about an unsolved crime, your actions can make a difference. If you know something, if you saw something, if you heard something that might be relevant to an unsolved case, come forward. You might be holding the key that unlocks a mystery, that brings closure to a family, that holds a killer accountable. Don't assume your information isn't important or that someone else has already reported it. Make the call. Talk to investigators. Be part of the solution. The Shaw case also reminds us of the importance of community, of neighbors looking out for each other, of not becoming so isolated that we lose our connection to the people around us. David Chen lived in isolation, nursing his resentments in the privacy of his own mind, disconnected from the community he inhabited. Perhaps if he'd had stronger social connections, if he'd had people to talk to about his anger and frustrations, the tragedy of August 14, 2001, might never have happened. We can't know for certain, but it's worth considering how isolation and disconnection can contribute to violence. At the same time, the community's response to Michael Shaw's death, the vigils and fundraisers and continued advocacy for justice, shows the power of collective action and shared grief. The community didn't forget Michael Shaw. They kept his memory alive, supported his family, and demanded answers. That sustained pressure, that refusal to let the case be forgotten, played a role in ensuring that resources were eventually allocated to solve it. As forensic science continues to advance, as genetic genealogy becomes more sophisticated, as investigative techniques improve, there's real hope that many more cold cases will be solved in the years to come. Cases that seemed hopeless are being reopened. Evidence that was collected decades ago is being reanalyzed. Families who had given up hope are getting phone calls telling them that finally, after all these years, there's been a breakthrough. The Michael Shaw case is proof that justice can prevail, even when it takes 23 years. It's proof that good investigative work, proper evidence preservation, technological advances, and family advocacy can combine to achieve outcomes that once seemed impossible. It's proof that cold cases are only cold until they're not, that they're only unsolved until they're solved. For Emma Shaw, Lily Shaw, and Dorothy Shaw, the conviction of David Chen brought a form of peace that had eluded them for over 2 decades. It didn't erase the pain, but it transformed it, gave it meaning, provided answers to questions that had tortured them for so long. They know what happened to Michael. They know who killed him. And they know he's being held accountable. That's not nothing. That's everything. This case reminds us that behind every cold case statistic, there's a human story. Behind every unsolved murder, there's a family still waiting, still hoping, still grieving. And sometimes, when science and determination and a bit of luck all come together, those families get the answers they deserve. If you have any information about unsolved cases in your area, please reach out to your local law enforcement. You might be the piece of the puzzle that finally brings someone home, that finally gives a family closure, that finally ensures justice is served. Every case matters. Every victim matters. Every family deserves answers. The story of Michael Shaw and the arrest that shocked a Milwaukee community 23 years after his death is a testament to the power of persistence, the advancement of science, and the unbreakable bond of family. It's a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never truly denied to those who refuse to give up. Thank you for listening to this story. May Michael Shaw's memory be a blessing, and may his case inspire continued efforts to solve the cold cases that still haunt our communities. Until next time, remember that truth has a way of emerging, even from the darkest places, and that justice, no matter how long it takes, is always worth pursuing.